For 500 years, Baghdad was the brightest city on earth. In February 1258, a Mongol army surrounded it. 13 days later, the Tigris ran black with the ink of 1,000,000 books. Picture a city of 1,000,000 people, when London held perhaps 15,000. Picture libraries so vast that a single scholar could not read them in a lifetime. Picture marble courtyards where Arab, Persian, Greek, Jewish, and Indian astronomers argued in 4 languages about the size of the moon. This was Baghdad in 1257. The capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. The seat of the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries. The beating heart of what historians now call the Islamic Golden Age. Algebra was invented here. The numerals you use to count money were perfected here. The medical textbooks of Ibn Sina were copied here by hand, in rooms that smelled of cedar and lamp oil. Baghdad had survived plagues. It had survived civil wars. It had survived caliphs who were poets and caliphs who were drunks. It had never, in 500 years, fallen to a foreign army. And on a winter morning in January 1258, the caliph in his throne room was told that 150,000 horsemen had appeared on the eastern horizon. He did not believe the report. The man riding toward Baghdad was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother of Monk, the great Khan in distant Mongolia. And the man his brother had personally tasked with finishing what their grandfather had begun, the conquest of the Islamic world from the Oxus River to the Mediterranean. Hulagu was not a barbarian. He read Persian poetry. His wife, Dokuz Khatun, was an Nestorian Christian who advised him. He traveled with astronomers and engineers. He kept Buddhist monks and Chinese siege specialists in his entourage. He was something far more dangerous than a barbarian. He was an engineer of cities, taken apart. 2 years earlier, in 1256, he had crossed into Iran and done something no army in 2 centuries had managed. He had destroyed the Order of the Assassins. The fortress of Alamut, perched on a peak the locals believed unreachable by mortal armies, surrendered to him. Its sect, which had terrified caliphs and kings for 150 years with hidden blades, simply ceased to exist. His Chinese siege engineers, brought west after the Mongol conquest of North China, had cracked Alamut open like a walnut. Then Hulagu turned south. By late 1257, his army had grown to perhaps 150,000 men. Mongol cavalry at its core. Armenian and Georgian Christian auxiliaries on the flanks. Chinese engineers with their wagons of trebuchets and mangonels rolling through the dust. He sent letters ahead. To every city, to every emir, to the caliph himself. The letters said the same thing. Submit, and live. Resist, and die. This was not a threat. It was a policy. And it had a perfect record. In the throne room at Baghdad, Al-Mustasim Billah read the letter and laughed. He was the 37th Abbasid Caliph. A man of inherited grandeur and, by every surviving account, no military instinct whatsoever. A note of caution here. Almost everything we know about Al-Mustasim's character comes from Persian chroniclers writing under Mongol patronage, men whose job was to make the caliph's downfall feel inevitable. So when they describe him as proud, indecisive, and badly advised by feuding ministers, we should remember that history is being written by his executioners. But the broad outline is consistent across sources. And the broad outline is this. Hulagu offered terms. Open the gates. Pay tribute. Recognize Mongol overlordship. Keep your throne, your title, your city. Al-Mustasim refused. He sent back messages that, according to the chroniclers, were not just refusals but insults. He reminded Hulagu that the world had trembled before Baghdad for 500 years. He reminded Hulagu that he, the Caliph, was the shadow of God on earth. He suggested that if Hulagu approached the walls, the entire Muslim world would rise behind him. None of this was true. The Muslim world had been splintered for 2 centuries. The Caliph commanded perhaps 50,000 soldiers, many of them ceremonial. His treasury was vast, and almost entirely unspent on defense. His Grand Vizier urged him to pay. His military commanders urged him to fortify. His Shia advisors, some sources say, urged him to do nothing, though this detail comes from sources hostile to them, and should be read with care. The Caliph did nothing. When Hulagu's final envoy arrived at the city gates, Baghdad's mob, or perhaps elements of the garrison, sources disagree, killed him on the spot. In the steppe code, killing an envoy was not a diplomatic offense. It was the one offense the Mongols never, ever forgave. Hulagu read the report. He gave the order. And 150,000 horsemen began to ride. The Mongol army arrived outside Baghdad on the 11th of January, 1258. They did not attack. For 2 weeks they did something stranger. They built. They dug. They surveyed the rivers. They sent engineers, those Chinese specialists Hulagu had brought from the steppe, to study Baghdad's water defenses. On the 29th of January, the siege proper began. Trebuchets began to throw stones over the eastern wall. Not Mongol stones, Baghdad sat in a flat alluvial plain with no quarries, so the Mongols had palm trees cut down, sectioned, and lobbed instead, until siege boulders could be sourced from distant hills. Meanwhile, engineers diverted parts of the Tigris and Euphrates. The canals that fed Baghdad's outer suburbs, the irrigation system that had made the city a green miracle in the desert, was opened, redirected, and turned into a weapon. Sections of the army on the western bank were drowned by the Caliph's own water in the first days. The Mongols rebuilt their lines and pressed on. By the 5th of February, the eastern tower had fallen. By the 6th, Mongol horsemen were inside the outer walls. The defenders pulled back through the streets. House by house. Mosque by mosque. The fighting in Baghdad was not a battle. It was a slow tide, rising through the alleys for 5 days. On the 10th of February, the Caliph rode out of the city gates with 3,000 of his court. He surrendered. He still seemed to believe, even then, that he would be ransomed. That his title would protect him. That the shadow of God on earth could not, in the end, simply be erased. What followed was a week the Islamic world would remember for 700 years. Mongol armies, by their own code, gave a sacked city to the soldiers for a set number of days. In Baghdad, the number was 7. The caliphal library was looted, then burned. The great madrasas, the teaching colleges that ringed the city, each with its own collection of manuscripts, were broken open in turn. By 1258, the original House of Wisdom of Caliph al-Ma'mun, founded 4 centuries earlier, was no longer a single institution. Baghdad's learning had spread across dozens of libraries, private collections, and teaching mosques. The Mongols, methodically, burned them. Manuscripts were thrown from the bridges into the Tigris. Centuries of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, poetry, handwritten, often unique, often the only surviving copy, went into the water. And here, according to the Persian chroniclers who survived to write it down, the river itself turned black with dissolved ink. Modern historians read this as a literary image, not literal hydrology. There is no way to actually blacken a river the size of the Tigris. But the image is doing something the chroniclers needed it to do. It is telling you that what was lost was not a thing you could replace. It was lost the way rivers are lost, by flowing away. For the caliph, Hulagu had a different protocol. Mongol tradition forbade the spilling of royal blood on the open earth. So on, or around, the 20th of February, al-Mustasim was rolled tightly inside a thick carpet. Mongol horsemen rode over the carpet, again and again, until the bundle stopped moving. According to the Persian historian Juvayni, who served in Hulagu's administration and is our most credible source, this is how the last Abbasid caliph of Baghdad died. Marco Polo, writing decades later and far from the scene, claimed instead that the caliph was locked in his treasury and starved to death surrounded by his gold. It makes a better moral. It is almost certainly not what happened. The death toll inside the city is still argued. Persian sources of the time claim 800,000. 2 million. Numbers that almost certainly cannot be true. Modern historians, Saunders, Lane, Morgan, settle on something more terrible because it is more believable. Tens of thousands at minimum. 200,000 or more, very plausibly. A city of 1 million, broken, in 7 days. The caliphate did not end on the 10th of February, 1258. But it ended in Baghdad. A Mamluk sultan in Egypt, hearing the news, took a surviving Abbasid prince into Cairo and installed him as a puppet caliph. A shadow of a shadow. That Cairo line would persist until 1517, when the Ottomans absorbed it in turn. But Baghdad as the political center of Sunni Islam was finished. The canal system the city had depended on, drained, breached, abandoned, never fully recovered. The population would not return to its 1257 level for 600 years. Hulagu rode on. He took Aleppo. He took Damascus. The Mediterranean was 30 days' march away. And then, in September 1260, at a place in Galilee called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, a Mamluk army from Egypt did the thing no one had done in 50 years. They beat the Mongols. In open battle. Decisively. Hulagu was not present, he had ridden east on news of his brother's death, and the force he left behind was smaller than what had taken Baghdad. Historians still debate how decisive Ain Jalut really was. But it stopped the westward expansion. The Mongols would never again ride freely toward the Mediterranean. Islamic civilization did not end with Baghdad. That is the deepest mistake we make about 1258. Mamluk Egypt rose. The Ottomans rose. Safavid Iran rose. Mughal India rose. The Islamic world after Baghdad produced Sinan, who built the Suleymani. It produced Akbar. It produced 4 more centuries of empires that ruled, between them, a quarter of humanity. But the specific Baghdad of al-Ma'mun and Ibn Sina and the Bayt al-Hikmah, the city that had been the world's library, that Baghdad was gone. The manuscripts went with it. We do not know what we lost. By definition, we cannot know. In 13 days, a city of 1 million people, the capital of a 500-year empire, the densest concentration of learning on the planet, was undone. Not because the Mongols were uniquely cruel. They had a code. They followed it. But because Baghdad's last caliph, sitting on 500 years of inherited certainty, did not believe, could not believe, that any of it could end. That is the lesson the Tigris carried away in the ink. If this changed how you see the fall of empires, subscribe. We reconstruct a lost world every week on Untold Ages.